Hello, my name is Marcus Ryman, as you can see on the screen, and I'm the director of TBA 21 Academy and its constituent entity, Ocean Space, and also driving the initiative Ocean Archive. Um, and I'm here today with Daniela Ziemann on the Environmental Humanities, a view from Venice virtual dialogues. And we've been asked first to introduce ourselves and explain how we got to where we are. And I guess for me, before I hand it over to Daniela, it's been a long and windy road to come to this place, and this place is a contemporary art program that is supporting artistic collaborative research and production to investigate the state of the ocean and our relationship and the relationship to the species that live within the ocean through the lens of art, and try to build a deeper relationship and understanding in other ways than research papers. And I got here, as I said, along a long and windy road. I come from the theater. Many years ago, I studied acting at the University Hochschule für Musik und Theater in Hamburg. And at the time already, I was quite fortunate. I didn't see it at the time as being fortunate, but I had a professor in uh, um, dramaturgy who was very keen on and very set on that we, as even in the performing arts, have to look at all the other forms of arts as well. And we need to be informed of what's going on now and what went on at the times that the plays that we were looking into, were written. And at the time, clearly, when you're occupied with doing what you're doing, you don't necessarily think that this is um, tremendously helpful, and especially looking into the history. Um, but I got very passionate and very interested about contemporary art, and Hamburg was a very good city to find out about what was going on at the time. Nevertheless, the arts was only an interest and a passion, and the performing arts was really what my professional career was supposed to be, and what I really enjoyed doing. And I did this for many years, for over a decade. But the way that theater in Germany works, and I really wanted to do theater, is if you're fortunate enough, it's rather like a factory work. It's a repertory theater, meaning every night's a different play, depending on how much interest there is from directors. You end up in many productions at the same time, and it becomes very repetitive because there's never the time to digest. It's very exploitative. It's a rather exploitative practice. Anyway, after 11 years, I thought I needed a break, and thought I would do something that is really necessary. And what could be very necessary is providing people with a roof and with music and with food. And so we opened up a restaurant with two friends, knowing very little about the restaurant business, except of one of us who had been in that business for a long time. But the whole thing turned more and more into a logistic performance, and a communal place than anything else, um, with with a number of kind of difficulties that we had to face, and we overcome them in a very creative manner. This place and the way where it was situated got a rather some interest from a number of people, including Daniela Ziemann, who at the time had come to Berlin regularly. And this was my first introduction to TBA 21 and the people that run TBA 21 and still run TBA 21. And And at the time, um, the foundation had just acquired, and I'm sure that Daniela will go more into the foundation, but had just acquired a building in that was supposed to go to Vienna, the Temporäre Kunsthalle, and there was a space in the back of this exhibition space, which was a temporary exhibition space that was also gastronomy, and so the question was to come up with an idea for that. All of this didn't work out the way that it was intended to, but at the time, the foundation was also doing a commission of Walid Rad, the American Lebanese artist, as a co-production, co-commission with the Wiener Festwochen, which is the performance festival, rather well-known performance festival in Vienna. And I started working on the translation for that piece because the Wiener Festwoche wanted Walid to perform every day, which he couldn't do, and so we needed to come up with a kind of solution how a presence similar to Walid could be there, but it wasn't Walid, and so whilst working closely with Walid, we came up with this character of the docent who would take visitors through the exhibition. And what the exhibition was that it was a layered experience between more installation work, sculpture work of Walid's, layered on top of this was a text. And this text was performing something that was really magical somehow, because it pulled away the carpet of reality under your feet in a very, very slow but steady motion. And whilst working with Walid, I really rediscovered my passion for the arts, and I've also realized that the arts in this way can do something that a theater evening cannot do. There were layers and layers and layers of information. There was history condensed into anecdotes. There was politics condensed into the description of what we see at the walls. There were layers of dimensions folded on top of each other. We were jumping through time, and the way that Walid worked and the way that he was generous enough to let me into the work with him was just completely a complete portal into this practice of what art can do, of what objects can be and mean, what life they can have with a narrative or without a narrative. Um, and yeah, this was the beginning for me. This was the beginning of a passion that has gripped me then and has not let go of me, but also a practice that he established, and I guess many other artists, but he is really the one that that was the most profound for me in the way that that he combines narrative with the object, um, the way that he combines and folds this narrative and information and conditions and situations into each other and ties them together with the situation in the space, and even performing this piece was nearly every night transformational. But I think really for anybody that is in the performing arts, this moment of transformation is really what we strive for. There's this ambition of inviting the audience, a guest, into the theater, and the ambition is that they leave, she or he leaves a different person, and this really happened over and over and over again in this evening or in this performance. And it happened because of the way it was constructed, and it happened in the way that he was telling the story. But it really did something to me in the belief of the transformative power of the arts. And at the time, we were approaching within the foundation, we were approaching the 10-year anniversary of the foundation with a space, and I'm probably hand it over to Daniela before we get to the academy. But then there was a moment where we started a new format, and this new format is what we're going to talk about and discuss in a little while. But I think before that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Daniela.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. I would like to take a little bit a different course and start earlier in my life, and perhaps talk a little bit how I got interested in our environmental and ecological issues. Because I think ecological issues in some ways predate, interestingly, my interest in art. Hard to say because these things sort of happen in your life. But I want to situate you. I grew up in Vienna in the 1970s. And so I was not part of the 60s movement, and certainly not part of any counterculture as it was experienced in France and the United States. But the 70s were sort of the second wave of a form of seeking for other forms and other types of communality. So we still had a very strong ecological movement that was tied in to anti-nuclear protest, alternative modes of living, alternative forms of thinking politics, and very strong engagement with justice, but justice based on this sort of idea of solidarity. So the 1970s, really, with everything happening in Latin America, in the Far East, in the Near East, so all the sort of social movements, and we had, of course, much less information at the time than today, but it was this general idea that the solidarity of people united, is the only form of bringing justice about. And of course, it is the time where our generation, growing up in the 70s, also felt that the Nazi past of our countries, and I think I'm speaking for you also, Marcus, the Nazi past of Austria, the Nazi past of Germany had to be decolonialized through a different sort of set of practices and ideas. And that's really where somehow the ecological movement became the platform for a lot of these discussions that were highly political, but also very much about the practice of living and living differently. And for some reasons and others, and that's hard to reconstruct, somehow the sort of Eastern ideas, coming from the Far East, from India, whatever, but a different kind of, let's say, spirituality was also interwoven in all of that. So the meditation practices, yoga came up, different ways of eating. I remember the sort of first book that blew me out, and you'll laugh, was a macrobiotics cookbook. Yeah, wow. So cookbooks can actually change lives, as you said, or cooking. And I was sort of reading that book, I remember, and it was sort of had no images at all, but it was all about the macrobiotic revolution. And that, of course, prompted me to say, well, I'm not going to eat meat in my whole life. No, it's like, why would you eat animals, your peers, if what you can provide for is actually, or how you can nourish yourself is actually provided by the world around you in sort of different ways. So I would say that's the magma. This is sort of the background that was sort of fueling my interest. As I indicated, communal movements were very strong. And I perhaps have to add to that although I was growing up here in Austria, my mother is Hungarian, and my sort of part of my family in Hungary, they were all peasants. They were all, people sort of working still the earth and the ground. And I was fortunate enough to sort of spend a lot of summers with my grandmother, my grandaunt, really just on the countryside, the most humble countryside in sort of socialist Hungary. So I think a lot of these practices also of, eating differently, living in the countryside, came very naturally to me. And it was always part of the sort of, I wouldn't say engagement, it was certainly not intellectual engagement, but again, that's the practice part. It's like, what do you do with the things you grow? How do you eat? How do you prepare it? How you conserve it? What is composting? So all the things that we're sort of maybe engaging with in the environmental humanities today in a sort of very intellectual way, were always part of my upbringing, I would say, until I reached the age of 12, 13. And after that, it became much more political. It was all about shaving hair and, testing feminist ideas and walking on the streets and so on and so forth. But so at the very heart of, who I am and how I can sort of speak as an ecological agent, I would say that these sort of early experiences were very, very important and very strong. Of course, many others. I came to the arts perhaps through philosophy. I was, again, very fortunate to be in school in a curriculum that was very much based in the philosophical. It was a French school, so it was very much based. I mean, we did a lot of Kant as well, because I think my professor at the time was a Kantian thinker. But of course, as we were a counter generation, everything that was taught to us was sort of looked at with disdain. So Kant was definitely not the person we got very engaged, but sort of, the anti-humanist philosophies of the 1960s and 70s. And I have to say, it took me probably 30 years to even understand a little bit about it. And I'm by no means a philosopher. But somehow it just kind of triggered also that interest of practice through ecological practices, but also of trying to find different tools of defining how we act in the world and how we know the world the way it is. And I was very interested in these possibilities of reformulation. And reformulation somehow then became the lead to art, artistic practice. It started then with a formalized education as an art historian. So I have a master's degree in art history. From there, I sort of continued working. We opened a small gallery, a student gallery at the time. This is now early 80s, mid 80s in Vienna still. From there, I got to the United States. I studied in America. I had another experience there. Came back in the late 80s, early 90s to Vienna to work in a very, very interesting place, which was the Museum of Applied Arts, the MAK in Vienna, with a formidable director, Peter Neuwer, very wild man. But again, someone who taught me that perhaps the sort of disciplinary categories in which we have been educated, separating art from architecture, from design, from philosophy, from theory, was a very vain attempt to categorize, organize, create hierarchies, and create systems of knowledge that work really well in books and in libraries, but that in fact the way artists are approaching the things is much more sort of interconnected and tries to really deconstruct. And deconstruction is, of course, the word of that moment. No, and this is now early 90s. Yeah. So I've learned a great deal being at the MAK, and I learned mainly through Peter how to be very interested in commissioning artists to do exhibitions and to do projects that are important in scale, in dimension, and ambition, because Peter never wanted to show anything that was sort of already made and already part of the world. This brought me, again, through several detours to meeting Francesca Habsburg, Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza, in Vienna. And that was a sort of coup de foudre meeting, two very different persons kind of coming together, one memorable evening. And we really, at that moment sort of hit on and started a conversation that's been lasting for nearly 20 years now. And I think our conversation is part of what sort of became TBA 21. And perhaps I won't talk too much about TBA at this point. Perhaps we can come back to that. But just to sort of finish then this interest in environment and ecology, I think it took another few iterations, to come back to sort of a stronger engagement with ecologies also through TBA 21, because I would say that perhaps the initial years of our engagement were more interested in issues of justice and intersectional justice, which of course at the end, sort of also always connects to the world in which we live and the ways we inhabit our environments. But I would say the most perhaps fundamental project to me that sort of reopened the gates was working with Amar Kanwar. Amar is an Indian artist based in New Delhi, a filmmaker who some point in the 2010s got very much involved with the indigenous movements in Odisha, one of the poorest states in India. But what he has been working on and looking at is the transformation of Odisha, which is, as I said, an indigenous state with a really beautiful natural environment, with holy mountains, holy rivers, very sort of, let's say, solidly built community, how the sort of industrial transformation was ravaging the social structures of Orissa, how the mining interests, specifically aluminium mining, and the whole apparatus of extraction around mining devastated a large part, not just of the ecological landscape, but also of the livelihoods of people, the Adivasi and Dalit populations of India. And some of the suggestions, some of the proposals or propositions that Amar was trying to formulate through the work that is called the Sovereign Forest, and that started, as I said, in 2011, is sort of an ongoing work. Were really very thought-provoking and very interesting, because he was not only trying to represent the injustice, in a way that we perhaps were thinking of it in the first decade of the 2000s, but he was actually asking more the questions, how can we even realize what is being lost? How can we start developing vocabulary of engagement? How can we do justice to those people and entities? And I'm saying entities because for Amar, it was not just human lives, but also non-human lives that were at stake. How can we find the language which does not force and represent these life forms, but actually finds different engagements? And these propositions that he made, and I'm not really going into them, but they were sort of indicating new methodologies of engagement and new methodologies through which art and artistic practice and artistic research, I would say, can try to avoid perhaps some of the shortfalls, yeah, that other types of knowledges, I would say, have demonstrated in the past in engaging with such issues. And I leave it at that, perhaps, for the moment. And we'll ask you now, Marcus, why the oceans?
Well, for that, I think I have to go also further back. The oceans, to give you a very simple answer first is, I think the oceans are my first real memory. My mom is Scottish. My family is from the west coast of Scotland, and so in the early years, before starting kindergarten, we would travel a lot back and forth between Germany and Scotland, and so this water of the west, off of the western Scottish coast, is somehow very, very, it's such a strong first memory for me, because it was so, I guess, so alien from what I know and had known from growing up in central Germany, in close to Frankfurt, right, where it's fields and forests and all of that, and all of a sudden I'm confronted with that. So I think the affinity to the ocean, to be drawn to the ocean, really comes from this very, very, very early memory. Why has it become the interest of the program, and the kind of the arena in which we engage? It is, it's really, I think at the time when I entered into this universe, the TVA 21 universe, there was an exhibition space. There was a regular exhibition program, even though it was connected to commissioning, but there was a kind of very steady calendar of activity, and a steady calendar of exhibition. And after this experience with Walid Rad, we tried to imagine other ways of doing so, and there was a possibility of coming together on a boat. And maybe this is the moment where we pull up the first slide. This boat has become, you see it in the far distance there, this boat has really become the heart of the academy for now, because I guess it might be that we're retiring from the boat this year, but nevertheless it gave us the possibility to be together for an extended amount of time on the ocean with a group of people that we had invited. And in the beginning, it was literally following this this practice of commissioning, inviting artists to come onto the boat to spend time on the ocean, with the ocean, immersed in the ocean, and to make sure that there is as much information as possible, and it doesn't turn into a field trip, an exotic field trip. We would invite scientists and legal experts and conservationists, and later on, when we moved into the Pacific, also indigenous groups, indigenous leadership, and so on. And what happened was really that we understood that the ocean is hardly explored. It's hardly, even scientists, marine biologists, physical oceanographers, cartographers, all of them are very open about the fact that they know in their language, the language of science, very little about the ocean. And having having had a taste of this other dimension that Walid was able to invite me into, this practice that Daniela was just describing, through the work with Amar, through work with Ernesto Neto, through then later on also something with work with Olafur Eliasson, that always went beyond. It went beyond. It went beyond what we would consider as knowledge, as something that can go into a book, that can go into a text, that can be received in a kind of intellectual form. This was really the moment where this idea to be with and on the ocean for an extended amount of time, to expose ourselves to also a movement and a rhythm that is so completely different than what we feel on land, and completely out of our control. And to work from this immersive experience as a transformative experience, and then to create something together in collaboration, which we didn't know what it was really, that was the beginning of this work. And this work was a project that then formed into a program, that then formed into a department, and now has, after 9 years of working, has found this home in Venice, from which the Academy started speaking last year, when we opened with a long-term research commission of Joan Jonas, which she worked closely with a marine biologist together called David Gruber. But all of this comes together to say there's the personal experience, and the personal kind of interest and very strong draw, and then understanding through the possibility of starting this project, that there's really the possibility to completely imagine a different way of building works, building processes, building a methodology, and through that building knowledge that I had not, and I don't think we had considered in the foundation before. And so the ocean has become the kind of the home to try to think with and from change, embody this fluidity, embody this kind of movement, and think from there and work from there. That's I think how that's my journey there, and it's clearly embedded in the TBA 21 universe that has always or that has been so fascinating for me, because what I've really learned and appreciated was that there is an organization, yes, but on the other hand, this organization never ceases to learn, never ceases to act upon the information that it receives through the collaborators that it works with, through Amar Kanwa, through Ernesto Neto, and through all of the others that we've worked with. But an organization that takes the concerns of its partners very, very, very seriously, and is not just providing space and the possibility to exhibit these concerns, but also digests them and tries to act upon it. And this is something that I had personally never experienced before. And it is, I think it's this kind of ethos that makes this work possible, that kind of also has diverted a little bit from the practice of the foundation, as it's trying to attempt to engage with other spheres like science, like policy, like conservation, in a more engaged way. But without this ethos, without this spirit, and without this kind of willingness and openness to question and scrutinize oneself constantly and constantly, and letting ourselves be transformed, nothing of this would have been possible. And so I send the question back to you. Why the ocean? You've been in the forest, you've been, you've been in the rice fields, you've been to so many places. Why the ocean?
That's a good question. Thank you, Marcus. Well, I would say, as you know, my primary interest was, and I think I mentioned it, that was sort of more coming from political ecology.
Mm,
So I was thinking for the longest time that ecology is always to be thought in the context of economic conditions and political conditions.
mm,
Because really, as I indicated, my formation is very much from sort of still a sort of a humanist. Um, that's what we call it, humanities. Maybe we
mm,
should rename it environmental post-humanities. Here we
yeah,
go.
yeah.
Uh, so I have to admit, I come from
Mm,
sort of a humanist tradition. I come from a place of thinking that roots me in a world where the human actor and his suffering and the injustices wrought upon him are were sort of my main concern. And I would say I was always interested in forms of artistic practices that could intervene in that set
mm,
or in that sort of condition, I would say. And I I would say that through starting to think with the oceans and think in the oceans, it really allowed me to take away the human
mm,
from, let's say, the biospheric engagement uh, with the earth, you know, and with the earth in the sense that I really understood that we have to think differently of the world and of the earth. And that in a way, there's an intersection clearly
mm,
between these components. But world and worlding is kind of a project, a communal project through which we can express in all these sort of complicated layers, approaches, sort of systems and conditions and networks of living and creating projects together as humans and non-humans that somehow reform the earth, that constantly seek to create formations in which the earth becomes something else. No,
mm,
it is a project of constant transformation. But to sort of think of the earth and the world, if you want, both without humans, um, through the ocean and with the ocean, really also allowed me to think about, I think, one of the things that I'm still most interested in the ocean, and that's its sort of unknowability.
mm,
To realize and come to the point where you understand that the systems of knowledges and practices that we grow up with are certain instruments, as I said before, that try to organize and categorize, but really through mostly sort of rationalistic approaches.
mm,
And to be confronted in a world of utter unknowability, and maybe we should also now show the first little video that we have sort of
mm,
of utter unknowability and of a very, very different form of organization of life. Um, also allowed me to sort of engage with something that is outside of knowledge, or where I would perhaps say differently, where the systems of knowledge, um, perhaps come into a form of a disbalance,
mm,
or in a crisis, in a crisis, no?
mm,
And where you need to sort of develop different tools. And the reason I showed this funny little video, so for the viewers, this is a video of a siphonophore. And siphonophore are these really fragile little animals, that sort of live as colonies, as they say, so as colonies of co-working sort of superorganisms that kind of distribute responsibility among parts of these organs. So it looks like one thing, but it's actually a myriad of different organizations, of different entities, no, that kind of have evolved together, that live together. They're like, if I want to use the word maybe sisterhood, they're a sisterhood or organization. They're a very rebellious life form. Yeah? It's very, very fragile. You know, if you swim in the waters of the Pacific, where you find a lot of these, you see how they're just composed very often of filaments, of gelatinous matter. And they kind of sort of wander through the waters, and they're, as I said, mysterious, eccentric completely. And I think what is so interesting about, and here again, the term unknowability, we don't really know how they function. No? We don't know how they can reorganize, how one organism takes on the responsibility of being the digestive system, how another organism takes on the responsibility of being sort of more the pilot entity, and so on and so forth. And I think, for instance, thinking with siphonophores, or going beyond that, thinking with water, as the wonderful feminist philosopher, thinker, Astrida Neyman, one of our common friends, has really taught us, really allows us to completely think outside of the terms which we've come to use as sort of, as I said, the rational formations of knowledge. And they engage us and throw us into, you know, they throw us in a sort of a different realm of worlding, of engaging resources, of care, and of, I would say a submersed perspective that doesn't kind of speak from a terrestrial ground, but one that is really submersed in the depth of, you know, of an oceanic. And maybe I leave it at that. These are sort of all large composite terms and concepts.
No, but just to follow on that, I think what I realized very quickly, traveling on and through the oceans, was and luckily being accompanied by scientists, and then with artists who have this incredibly inquisitive mind, and the ability very often to ask profound questions head on, without any vanity of sounding stupid or not. They just have the ability to ask these questions. And what I realized was that the ocean, although undeniably interconnected, undeniably always changing, always moving, impossible to say where's the border, because it's constantly moving and swelling and contracting and all of this. Nevertheless, somehow science tried to describe it in silos. We look at this and we look at this and we don't look at this and we don't look at, and this seemed to me very, very, very absurd. And then we looked at the realm of policymaking and laws, and again, there's these weird little sections that are drawn in fantastical ways across the ocean, and they say, okay, this is territorial waters, this is exclusive economic zone, this is the high waters, the high seas are the common heritage of humankind. And you're confronted with all of these concepts that are somehow fantastical and go back to a legal text from 1609 by a Dutch guy who wanted to provide access for the Dutch Empire, and which one? It's not the East India Company. It's the the Dutch equivalent, and wanted to provide access to goods in what we now know as Indonesia and so on. So the all of these things, that there's this siloed approach, that there is a very slow moving, changing legal system and policy system that is based on exploitation, extraction, the flow of capital, and has very little to do with the environmental realities that we're facing now, but has everything to do with perpetuating these systems that we've been now seeing how, you know, through the lens of COVID, we see all of these injustices just coming out in such visible ways. But they were, I mean, this is not news. This has been visible and known for such a long time, and that was really the moment where it is a question, with all of the environmental concerns that come on top of it, for us individually, but then as practitioners and being in a kind of directing role of this organization, how do we engage, right? What is our responsibility? And there we come, I think, to care. What is our responsibility as individuals, as practitioners, and as an organization when we know all this? How do we respond to this? And I think if we pull up the second slide, there's maybe something that we can discuss. So this is the Chiesa di San Lorenzo, which is now since last year Ocean Space, and on the facade you see a line of light, which is an artwork by Territorial Agency, a London-based architecture collective by Anne-Sophie Ronskog and John Palmesino, and this work is called When Above. And if you have seen the images of Venice from the end of last year, November, December, you will remember the flooding. And the flooding on this Campo di San Lorenzo was up until, you see the stairs back there, and it was the second or third step was covered with water. This was nearly a record-breaking flood. 1966, at least as far as the records go, was higher. But what we see here, when above, is the potential that is locked in to the atmosphere in terms of CO2 emissions of the sea level rise, if we stay, and this is the potential, if we stay within the 2-degree temperature rise until the end of this century. This is not a prediction. This is not the prediction of disaster or kind of striving on these catastrophic narratives. It's an indication. It's an indication, and it is, I think, a challenge to us to think, how do we live with these processes that are in motion? How do we live with responsibly and full of care? And we come to something that I think is dear to you as well: care, repair, restoration, and love. How do we actively and applied live with these concepts when this is a future that is on the cards, that doesn't not have to be, but there are processes that are in motion. And I personally find the narrative of how do we stop climate change a very difficult one, because it's cries for solutions that are not going to happen. And it's taking something into account, or something not into account, which is the process that is already underway. So this kind of question of how to stop is also an illusion of how do we stay in this very comfortable situation that we are in now. And I think what you described in the beginning, and something that I've learned through the theater, is a question of practice. How do we practice to live with the processes that are in motion? How do we practice to live with the responsibility that there is nothing that we can stop, but there is that we can live with. And there is also the possibility to repair, to restore, and to care for our human friends, our more than human friends, and the environment in which we're situated. And I think thinking with and from the ocean, and with that, with and from Venice, that kind of is situated in the heart of this very fragile ecosystem, is not just an opportunity because there's so many visitors, and Venice has this fabulous tradition of questioning itself and the world and its reality through the lens of art, but it's also a responsibility that we take on. How do we engage with this environment in a very practical and a very applied way? And this is not really a question. This is just a kind of a description of the way that I see our responsibility there. But I think maybe you can talk about these different forms of these different practices of care that are possible, that we can imagine together with artists like Amar, or you know, the program that you've created together with Olafur for the Greenlight, which are, I think, are really applied practices of care. And there maybe we talk about a little bit the role of artists in this kind of collaborative way of making programming, and making programming that goes beyond objects in a space.
We have already reached 52 minutes, but I'm...
Oh my God.
I don't know how this is going to be received. But yes, I think what you're describing, Marcus, are, you know, the search for tools which, you know, surpass this idea of a moralizing manifesto to save the planet. No, I think what are the tools? What are the methods? Yeah, and if you take method as as a translation for the ways, you know, the path, really. And here we have again the mobility, the sort of also inner transformation that is necessary. So for me, methods are not just kind of prescribed ways of going about, and now we just change from method A to method B. Yeah? So this is a much more sort of, let's say, non-scientific approach to the question of what are the tools, what are the methods, what can we really deploy to dismantling, on one hand, some of these, you know, systems of injustices and extractivism and so on that we talked about, but also that can lead to knowing differently. And I think, you know, Spivak's unlearning is still, you know, such an important concept to bring about, specifically in the context of environmental humanities, because there's so much unlearning. And I think this is a little bit what I've also tried to indicate in my own experience. Yeah, so much unlearning from the ways of acquiring knowledge, developing practice, you know, that we have been given, you know, being part of sort of a dominant Western white world that sort of has seen its supremacy and established in its supremacy very firmly, and both as a political system, as an economical system, and as a system of knowing. And the way I care to think about that is that this, what we call system again, is not a system that was imposed by us, but it's a choice that we made. It's a choice that we made probably, you know, 500 years ago, to develop a certain project through which to live on this planet. And it's a project that at the end seeks economic gain, you know, progress, a form of science that sort of works to supplement that project, to allow it, to facilitate it. So, and of course, artistic practices that were very closely tied in. So this system in a way, and I think that is the huge difficulty of a project of teaching environmental humanities, as I said, to dismantle that system, to finding tools that allow different ways of knowing, different practices, different notions of care, and really taken on one hand seriously enough to kind of break the monoepistemic Western kind of hierarchy. It's like there is only one way of knowing, there's only one way of being, but to allow for these pluralities of engagements, ways of knowing, and traditions. And as I said, take them seriously in the sense that they are not just traditions as we like to sort of see them very often, again, from our part of the world. We like to sort of say, well, the tradition of Amerindians and the tradition of Pacific Islanders, more in this kind of almost touristic image of, oh my God, they have, this, but to understand that they are equally developed systems of knowing, of engagement, of practice, very, very long lasting forms of even, how can I say, not just socially, but also legally engaging with communalities. So knowing differently, just maybe to bring up the last image. So please, my last image, and maybe talk just very, very briefly about knowing differently and knowing through the arts. This is an image that was provided by Rasmus Nielsen, one of the members of Superflex. And clearly what you see is you have this figure of the white human male, trying to engage with a fish, with an animal who obviously is not so interested in hamburgers, trying to sort of teach him or her or it, the sort of vocabulary of Western capitalism, and see how these kind of communications and engagements could take place. So clearly, it is a provocation, and I'm also sort of drawing on that image to do that, obviously. So how can we think of a more than human world? How can we actually even speak for that more than human world? And again, with Spivak and with Naimanis, we're there in this question: how can we have even the hubris to try to raise our voices on behalf of other entities and beings? But I think what we can do, and I think that's where art becomes so interesting, is we can try to, and we have to try to, and we have to deploy all possibilities to think through it, to practice it, to engage with it, and to test also the limits of these possibilities. And of course, Rasmus is never going to teach this fish what a hamburger is, nor will the fish ever spell out the word hamburger. But it is kind of a provocation at interaction, interactivity, relationality, and as you said, of deploying that form of noticing and caring, of creating these sort of temporary patches. And I think that's maybe a last idea I'd like to stress. Temporary patches in terms of, or in times of great transitions, and great unknowability and great transformation. We are clearly in that moment, as you beautifully described, Marcus. We are at the moment of radical, I wouldn't even say change, but of radical transformation of what it means to live on this planet, how our worlding project has come to be very, very fragile, how the futurities that are embedded in this worlding more and more depend on this entity called our Earth and its system and entanglements. And in order for us to live well, to die well with Haraway in this new world, yeah, which is going to be radical, is already radically different, and the virus just again being a small indication of that huge difference that we are living through. We need to engage with different methods, tools, possibilities, plays, and forms of telling stories. And for me, the arts and the possibility of artistic practice of telling these different stories, which I like to sort of call kind of counter stories. No, I mean counter research, again, a very important tool for me. This is, I think, what we are trying to do, and we're trying to do as imaginatively and playfully as possible, but also always keeping in mind that the stories have to be sometimes told in the microscopic and in a sort of very nearsighted view, but sometimes you also need to enlarge the perspective, no, and sort of move out of the picture to see larger assemblages of conditions. And perhaps this is what we are trying to do now, currently, with Oceans in Transformation, the project that Territorial Agency has been working on for many, many years now. And I would say that is a project that tries to sort of take the large scopic view on our sort of planetary systems and transformations. But perhaps now we should bring out
we should go over to the books, but I think once you pull out the books, I'm going to read a little quote from our friends from Rax Media Collective.
Yes.
Just describing a little bit or underpinning what you've just described very, very beautifully. But they say, it may well be said that the relationship between contemporary art practice and the generation of new knowledge is not just a way of rendering information into aesthetically pleasing or challenging objects and processes. It's not just a matter of translating research or even deep archival investigation into an artwork. Ultimately, it boils down to a question of giving form to things that might be unthinkable without the act of giving form to them. It is the making of art in this instance that makes it possible to think a new thought as well as the other way around. Sometimes this may mean attempting to think the unthinkable. And I think with your notion of the unknowable and accepting that we are not able to know everything, right? And with the understanding that processes are in motion, that we don't know where they're going, but to stick with the trouble and to imagine and allow ourselves to think these unthinkable thoughts and giving form to them in a temporary way and making them reality for the time of the commission, for the process of making something, and then for the exhibition. I think this is what we're trying to attempt at Ocean Space, and this is what we're trying to attempt at the Academy. And now we've been asked to present a book each that is kind of representative of what we've been doing. And I have chosen the first publication of the Academy, which is called Tidalectics. It went imagining Tidalectics, imagining an oceanic worldview through art and science. It was a publication with MIT Press that we did after our first ever exhibition, which was called Tidalectics as well. And it is It's a compendium of texts that provide many, many, many different views and entry points, sensibilities and sensitivities. It's has many different languages, and I think it's exactly this. It's not giving an answer. It's giving a number of possibilities, and maybe in the spaces in between is something more. What did you choose?
I have two books.
Okay.
I only have one here, so that's why I'm cheating a little. Okay, so Alien Ocean by Stefan Helmreich, Anthropological Voyages in Microbiology, perhaps connects more readily here to my siphonophores and their sort of alien intelligence, and as I want to sort of propose them as a new organizational form for institutions, there is a lot of that here. But I've decided yesterday, since I've received news from our friends in the Amazon, from a group of Amerindian shamans and practitioners, how terrible their plight is currently under the Bolsonaro regime, and of course the immediate threat through Corona. And it really touched me and hurt me terribly, because there is so much loss of life and there's so much injustice, and there's a real possible genocide in the making. And I'm not using the word very lightly, but a very large sort of population of indigenous practitioners and peoples under threat. And that made me think of a book that I'd like to suggest, and I don't have it here, so I'll just read the title. It's Macarena Gomez Barris's book, The Extractive Zone, and the subtitle is Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspective. And it speaks of extractivismo, no? Which is really the sort of Latin American word for that sort of complex of an economic system that works on theft, borrowing, land grabbing, displacement of population, completely violent reorganization of social lives for humans and non-humans. And what Gomez Barris does in the book is constantly sort of bring into conversation Amerindian shamans and practitioners as interlocutors, to sort of really speak of, what I called also a submersed perspective, to speak with them, to speak through their knowledges, but also to, develop sort of a theoretical tool, how to actually start understanding this extractive zone, which now has become a rather planetary zone, including the oceans, including the Amazon, a zone that is sort of going or undergoing massive sort of reorganization. And I would very much recommend that as being sort of part of a syllabus for the environmental humanities. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think, we're now at an hour and 10 minutes. I think we have done our our part. We are fashionably over time. Daniela, it's been a complete pleasure to be able to talk to you like this. We haven't had the chance to speak like this for a while. We're producing in a hamster wheel. Thank you.
Likewise, and please feel free, whoever does the editing, to me chop here and there. Yeah. We both have the tendency of speaking a lot, so
yes. Okay.
Can be shortened. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Exactly. Thank you for the invitation.